part of the challenge around 1 or 2 day event delivery, which is largely what I do now, is scaling teams very, very quickly and trying to instill culture through that. So we did a volunteer briefing last week down in Queenstown. I referred to the volunteers as we're like family and friends now. But yeah, I think that the tribal sort of mentality of setting up a really short-term workforce, any tricks or hacks that you can use to do that is really, really cool.
That was Chris Randle, Regional Director of IRONMAN in New Zealand. Not many event professionals can say they kick-started their career at the Olympic Games, but after a leap of faith and an impromptu career change, Chris did just that. Since his first role as a project manager at the London Olympic Games in 2012, Chris has gone on to experience and enjoy the event's buzz at some of the world's premium mass participation events. During the podcast, Chris and I chat about how IRONMAN manages to engage with their volunteers year on year, including the strategies they have implemented to combat cancellations and postponements as a result of COVID-19. Chris also shares his insights into IRONMAN's unique partnership program for volunteers, highlighting the ways in which sponsors can provide a great opportunity to enhance the volunteer experience to increase engagement, retention, and overall volunteer satisfaction. This podcast was recorded remotely, so we do apologise for the broken audio at times. Here's hoping these podcasts can be recorded in person sooner rather than later. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Chris Randle, welcome to the Engage Volunteer podcast, mate. So good to have you on. How are you over there in New Zealand?
Doing really well, Shannon. Thanks very much for inviting me on. We were just talking before and we just come back from New Zealand Sotheby's International Queenstown Marathon, which we delivered over the weekend. So after the year we've had, I'm just rediscovering what it's like to be event fatigued.
Yeah, you are. You would have been accustomed to it for the last, 20 years, mate, but now it's a bit of a change, hasn't it been? How has the year been for you guys and IRONMAN? Pretty tough, no doubt.
Yeah, well, the New Zealand season for us is through the summer. So we actually had a really incredible start to the year this year in February and March, and we delivered 3 events before COVID was a real thing. So we managed to do Tarawera Ultra Marathon, IRONMAN New Zealand, and the Motatapu. Mm-hmm. And it was actually while we were at IRONMAN New Zealand and Motatapu that COVID really came into everyone's consciousness in March. And we were sat in an Airbnb down in Arrowtown, just outside of Queenstown, with myself, our managing director, Dave Beach, and we were on calls with the team in Australia because we thought we may be going into lockdown partway through the event.
Wow.
So we were lucky to get that off, and I flew back up on the Monday just in the middle of March. The next time I got on a plane was last week. So it's obviously had a major impact on everyone's lives and a major impact on the events industry. Fortunately, in some ways for us, there was only one event that was directly impacted during lockdowns, which was Hawke's Bay Marathon in May, which we postponed to September and subsequently had to cancel because of the second set of lockdowns in New Zealand. But unfortunately, there's been some other casualties for our events. We were due to deliver, we'd have been on site right now, actually opening to the public tomorrow, the IRONMAN 70.3 World Championships in Tokyo. That's been moved to 22. We've also had to hibernate Pioneer Mountain Bike Stage Race and the wider implications across not just our region, but around the world. We've either cancelled or postponed hundreds of events across the IRONMAN portfolio, and our team's done a sterling job to bury themselves to try and get the events up, not just for the athletes, but for the communities and the regions as well. And it's been heartbreaking every time we've had to change one.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the unknown benefit at the time of the Southern Hemisphere events period through winter, COVID, it appeared to be, compared to, I guess, your colleagues in Tampa and other parts of the world as well, with IRONMAN having an extremely tough year. But we'll get into that, Chris. Mate, I'd really love to almost start where it began for you. I know from our relationship that you probably dipped your toe in the water at one of the biggest ones in events with the London Olympic Games. Can you tell me a bit about why you started there and how you decided to get started?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting story about how I got to where I am now. But prior to the London Olympics, I had no experience in events whatsoever. My background, I did an engineering degree. And then I got into project management on big infrastructure and engineering projects in the telecom space and the rail infrastructure space. And that was sort of the first 8-9 years of my career, was working in project management and those environments. And I vividly remember standing on the platform of Paddington Tube Station one day in central northwest London. And there was a big advert for the London 2012 Olympics. This was about October 2011. And I just had this eureka moment. And I thought, that would be cool. I should actually see if the Olympics need project managers. And I went online, and for the Olympics in London, you sort of submitted your CV to a pool, and they then looked at that. So you weren't specifically applying for a job in particular, but I was very lucky that they were looking for project managers, and they were sort of desperately looking for project managers at that time. And within the space of a few weeks, I'd actually been interviewed, been offered a role working on the Olympic Park common domain with a whole heap of Australians, actually. I worked for a guy called Brian Kelly, who has been on the major games scene for quite some time. And he was involved in Sydney Olympics and most recently, I think, the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast and things like that. But so dove into that, and I was project managing big parts of the common domain, in particular, big sponsor showcases and big signage projects and wayfinding projects. And I really enjoyed it. And it was just one of the things that I loved about the Olympics compared to what I'd previously been doing was the people and the end goal. Sure. I've been working on these huge multi-billion projects where you didn't sort of have that much human interaction, but also the end goal was so far away, it was intangible. So, and through my Olympic experience, I went into doing site management of the Olympic Park during the games, and I just got absolutely caught on the buzz. It was absolutely incredible, and it was actually my first experience with volunteers as well. Was the Olympics. You don't really find too many volunteers on major rail infrastructure projects.
No, I couldn't imagine.
And again, I have a vivid memory of standing outside the basketball arena. We were bumping out. I think it was basketball and hockey were doing a sort of, the people were leaving both those venues at the same time. And this American couple came up to me and thanked me for volunteering on the Olympics. I was a bit of an awkward moment because all the staff and all the volunteers are wearing the same uniform. It was a slightly awkward moment, but just that genuine appreciation for volunteers, that people would go out of their way to walk across a packed concourse to come and thank somebody. And that was a really cool moment.
Can I just do a side note here? The idea of volunteers and staff wearing the same uniforms has actually been brought up a few times through the podcast about treating them the same. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've learnt much from that experience of not really classifying one versus the other because everyone's kind of working toward the same goal.
It's really fascinating that that's come up, actually.
It has,
My initial reaction is that there could be quite a few cool benefits from a team building and cultural point of view from doing that.
Culturally,
I think part of the challenge around 1 or 2 day events delivery, which is largely what I do now, is scaling teams very, very quickly and trying to instill culture through that.
For sure.
So we did a volunteer briefing last week down in Queenstown. I referred to the volunteers as we're like family and friends now. And I was trying to use it to get an invite to go luge racing with some people. But that's...
Were you successful? Did it work?
No one came to find me afterwards. It must have been a really, really, really poor speech.
You can work on it the next time,
But I think that the tribal sort of mentality of setting up a really short-term workforce, any tricks or hacks that you can use to do that is really, really cool. And I think a bit further on that one, it's a really interesting concept. Since I've just mentioned it from the Olympics, it's not come up again.
I digress there anyway. But anyway, mate, you've gone from London, you got the buzz, addicted to that, being able to see a finish line. And you've now probably gone to the far degree of seeing that many times a year now for all the projects that you do. I know you spent a bit of time with Lagardère previously. When was that around?
Yeah, so I left LOCOG London 2012 in November 2012. So we did Olympic Park bump out, and then I was actually in doing a belated OE. I was floating around Asia after that and got introduced to Dave Beach and previous colleagues at Lagardère, Michelle Hooper, Brenda Burke, who's now on America's Cup. And they were looking for people for the 2013 ITU World Triathlon Series in Auckland as contract roles.
Sure.
David just set up Lagardère Oceania off the back of the 2012 World Triathlon Series Grand Final. So I was offered a role and I did my interview on Skype sitting on a beach in Koh Lanta in Thailand. It was probably the most amazing place I've ever had an interview. And it was the first time that I got into sort of event contracting. And I didn't really know what I was doing. So I came over to New Zealand the following week. I sort of ditched the Thailand holiday and came straight over here. And I'd been hired, I think it was like a fixed contract role. And I just used to go to the office every day. And apparently they didn't know what on earth I was doing because they were paying me to sort of do 2 weeks work. I turned up for about 10 weeks consecutively. And I'd leave and go home. And apparently they were chatting behind my back saying, does this guy know we're not paying him for this? And again, it was the people. I just loved the people. I loved the buzz of creating the triathlon event, which was, we delivered that 2013, 14 and 15. That was the last year we did it in Auckland. But it was just such a cool event. Our live broadcast on Sky Sports, road closures, grandstands, blue carpet, elite athletes, thousands of age groupers. I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. So, I worked for Dave through 2013 through to 2016 at Lagardère. I managed to get from being a contract role all the way to being a full-time member of staff and got my permanent resident visa during that time, which meant I could stay here and get a real job.
Sure. Yeah.
And through that time as well, I had a really great time working with Dave and the team developing new events. We launched Queenstown Marathon, which has been incredibly successful. We worked on the Mototapu off-road event. One of my babies was developing Hawke's Bay Marathon and then developing the Pioneer Mountain Bike Stage Race, which is probably the craziest thing that Dave has ever sort of come up with. I used to sit the other side of like a glass divide with him in 2014 and he knocked on the window one day and said, "If you got 2 minutes?" And that was the next 4 years of work on the Pioneer right there.
Sure.
Yes, and then became race director during that time, and Lagardère Unlimited was acquired by IRONMAN, World Triathlon Corporation, in April 2016. And I've been regional director now for New Zealand since January 2017. So I guess coming up to just about 4 years in my current role. And that's added ASB Auckland Marathon and Nutrigrain Ironman New Zealand to what I am involved with. So now 8 events a year, which has sort of been our cadence for the last couple of years, from October through to May. COVID's had a little bit of an impact on that. We got 6 planned for 2021. And they're all pop-up greenfield site events, which is about the most challenging thing you can do, I think, with events, which is create something in the middle of nowhere from nothing.
Yep, absolutely. Brilliant, mate. And it's been great sort of watching from the side from the growth of that business over there in New Zealand and the events that you guys are putting on. I'd love to dive a bit into the volunteer side now, Chris, and just talk about COVID. Now, you mentioned there's only one sort of main event that sort of slipped up through COVID. How have you guys managed to engage with your volunteers through this time? I know it would be more challenging for those, for example, in America that are needing to cancel events pretty frequently. But for you, what have you done to engage with your volunteers through this period to make sure that when your events are coming back, that they're ready and raring to go again?
There's probably 2 parts to that. The first one being that our teams have done an incredible job to recruit volunteers. In the case of Hawke's Bay Marathon, we've recruited those volunteers twice and then not needed them at all in May and September. And then more recently with ASB Auckland Marathon and also with Queenstown Marathon. So we hire local volunteer managers for each event.
Sure.
We don't have a centralised volunteer workforce function in New Zealand. So it's part of our race director's responsibility, and they all choose to find somebody to do that local engagement, recruitment, management, communication piece. We've been very lucky with both Hawke's Bay and Queenstown that our volunteer managers in those 2 areas, Beth and Karen, have been returning for the last couple of years. And Auckland, we were really lucky that we had a highly engaged ex-Fairfax team member who worked with a bunch of my colleagues in Australia. So putting the time in is the first thing, making sure that communication's there, and Karen, Beth, and Sam all did a really, really fantastic job of that. But I think the biggest thing for us, the biggest realization we've had over the last couple of months is that communities really see the benefit of events again, and almost to the point where they are very excited to be involved with events. So it's not been too much of a challenge to get people involved. There's certainly been a challenge with some of our groups, which is where we do most of our volunteer recruitment these days.
Through groups,
Through groups. Some of our groups have either sort of disbanded or ceased to exist due to COVID.
Sure. Yeah, okay.
Which has probably been the biggest challenge. And then recruiting new groups, identifying those groups and recruiting them. But then the other part has been some groups that have previously been highly engaged because of the volunteer donations or the honorarium payments to groups. They haven't been fundraising for the same things that they usually do, because they have typically, sports clubs have used volunteer donations for overseas travel or tours or things like that. And there's just not the availability of that. So they've kind of been the two big challenges. And to get around that, we've really relied on networks and partnerships, and making sure that we are utilizing who we know and trying to find out who they know. So that's through our council engagement or through partnerships or other means.
What's a good example of one of your partnerships there, Chris?
So a really key one for us is with ATED, Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development. They have some fantastic networks with their own facilitation as well. So we are able to work with our facilitator and our management team at ATED, and they help us introduce to other people. And in fact, we have now just been approached to push out messages for ATED for some of their other events to our independent volunteer groups that we've got. So it's very much a complete exchange of fair value there, I suppose.
Interesting, yeah.
Because it's more than just our event, it's all of the events. And I think one of the challenges we were probably going to face in Q3, Q4 this year was just so many events happening and saturation almost, not just for participation and ticket sales, but for volunteering as well. So it's working out how those networks can assist each other, and actually not just in the volunteer space, but in general terms.
It's an interesting topic, because I think pre-COVID, and a lot of people in this world of mass participation would agree, it's pretty competitive and sort of closed door process. In particular in Australia, here it is. People probably not sharing that information as freely. Have you seen a change through COVID where people are now more open to helping each other and sharing that kind of information? Or is that a New Zealand thing where it's always happened like that?
I mean, New Zealand is generally a pretty sharing and caring place. It's one of the things that I love about this country.
Absolutely.
But I certainly have found that people are more open to share what would probably previously have been quite closely guarded IP.
Yes.
So I think there's more engagement in the greater need for the event industry to operate together. I think you're probably seeing that with some of the AMPC work over in Australia as well, where I know that our overall CEO, Andrew Messick, has mentioned on a couple of our global calls that he's spoken to people that would, up until COVID, would have been our biggest competitors. And he's now talking to that. How are you dealing with it? What are you doing? And it's not just from a business point of view, but it's from an empathetic,
we're in it together situation.
Totally. Mental health, physical health and well-being has been so massive this year. And event organizers typically will go to the nth degree to do as many hours as they possibly can. And I've spent more time on the phone this year to other organizers myself personally that I probably wouldn't have done normally. And that's worked really well, but also through council partnerships and the New Zealand Event Association, who've done a really good job to sort of get consistent messaging out there as much as it's been possible to.
So you're actively trying to share your, not necessarily the database and sending email addresses to people, but happy to promote on behalf of other events or those needing volunteers to your database, presuming that you would have one of the larger databases around the country, given the amount of events that you do.
Yeah, I think there's a balance to be had there with sharing databases. So we don't share it if anyone's listening and they're wondering about me sharing all the details. We don't share.
What's your email, Chris?
We don't share database content itself.
Yeah, of course.
But we also need to make sure that we're maintaining what we need for ourselves. So in the case of ATEED, they were looking for a busy summer season. We only have one event in Auckland, so it's a little easier for us to share, push a message out, say, thanks very much for helping out with ASB Auckland Marathon. We'd be delighted if you're interested in doing more volunteer work. These are the events that are coming up. Please sign up here, or that sort of thing. I think is really easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's adding value and showing that you appreciate volunteers too. It's not about saying you're just going to sit here in my database until I need you again, because these volunteers are volunteering with you because they like to volunteer as well. And so it's not they must volunteer with the other organization or whatever. It's about sharing them opportunities that may relate to them, that ultimately just makes a connection stronger between you and that volunteer, hopefully in the long run. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of just trying to help your volunteers where you can?
Yeah, I don't think we've got a huge amount of data to back up this, but
of course,
I think people want to know what opportunities exist. Whether they take them or that's down to them.
Yeah, just visibility.
Yeah, I got a funny story about how that backfired though. Back in 2017, we were engaged to deliver cycling road running events for World Masters Games in Auckland. And I shared our database for World Masters Games volunteering. I think it was the Auckland Marathon database and the World Triathlon Series database. I can't recall exactly the specifics. But the volunteers all signed up for other sports. So we our volunteers that we thought, they'd want to work on the bit that we were doing, because it wasn't obvious. They all signed up for a bunch of other stuff. So it was a really tricky situation, because we then had to scramble. And fortunately, the team at World Masters Games really were massively helpful in that space. But it was we certainly undermined our own strength database there.
If there's a lesson there, it's about timing and picking the right partners, probably, that won't clash with what your ultimate goal is.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Just talking about the number of volunteers, we across our events, 7 events, we have over 5,000 volunteers work with us a year across our events in New Zealand. So that's quite a few. And generally, they range from sort of 400 or 500 across some of our smaller events, all the way up to nearly 2,500 at IRONMAN New Zealand, which is probably the biggest volunteer group sort of for a 1 or 2 day event that I'm aware of in New Zealand. Part of the success of that program is with our partnership with Mercury. They've been the volunteer partner for a number of years, and they do a great job of helping us look after the volunteers at the event with volunteer hubs and food and sustenance and hats and sunscreen and all of that good stuff. So I think one of the other things that's worked really well for us is great partnerships with volunteer sponsors. And
so just to be clear, they're a direct sponsor of your volunteer program?
Yes, and 3 of our events have direct volunteer program sponsors. So Mercury with IRONMAN New Zealand, Ryman with Auckland Marathon, a retirement home type business. I may have slightly misrepresented what they do there. I'll probably get into trouble for calling it that, but I think it's generally what they do. And then with Queenstown Marathon, we have Skyline as our volunteer partner. They've been now a volunteer partner for a couple of years, and all of those partnerships are there because those particular partners want to engage with community rather than specifically with athletes.
Participants,
or participants, athletes. So this year, for the first time at Queenstown Marathon, we were vastly oversubscribed in our volunteer program. We had to shut our Rosterfire registration system off because we were so overwhelmed with demand. We actually thought we were going to run out of T-shirts.
I reckon a few of our listeners will be rolling their eyes at you at the moment going, come on, give me a break.
Well, they will, but I can certainly say that the Skyline program, and a couple of other factors that I'll touch on as well, but the Skyline volunteer program has had a major impact on that.
Awesome. And how so? What is it that's changing?
So Skyline in particular, they're a tourism business. So they've been massively hit by COVID as well, going from an incredible downsizing in staff numbers this year. But they want to help the locals engage with tourism. One of the ways that they do that is there's the gondola. If you've ever been to Queenstown, or if any of the listeners have been to Queenstown,
there's the honeymoon there a few years ago. I had the best time ever.
What an absolutely beautiful place to have your honeymoon.
Absolutely.
But there's the Skyline gondola, which is just right in the centre of Queenstown, and it goes up, and you can do luge racing up there. There's a restaurant. It's absolutely incredible views out over the Wakatipu Basin, the area. So all of our volunteers receive a gondola annual pass as part of their
annual
volunteer.
Pass.
Yeah, so they can go up as many times as they want during the year.
That would be huge, gondola. Wouldn't it, for a local that would want to be utilising? Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and that really is the kicker. I think it's finding what really would resonate with the volunteers that a partner can provide, and in that case, that works really, really well. And then they get discounts on a bunch of other things as well. And we have done our volunteer briefing in the same venue every year for Queenstown Marathon. And this year, we had to put out extra rows of seating because there were so many people coming in. I was absolutely blown away. So I think largely a really engaged sponsor or partner can add huge value to that. I also think it's probably one of the more undervalued properties
the assets that you have
sold. So we typically go title sponsor, race distance sponsor, then you've got your endemic sponsors like shoes and bikes and all those things. And sometimes it can be a little tricky to find those synergies with a slightly less usual endurance sport company. And I think the volunteer program is one that has got massive appeal, particularly if you want to engage with communities.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's one I've always thought has massive opportunity, but I've never seen it done well. I'd like to dive into it a little bit, Chris, about how you go about it. I mean, is it a financial decision for you guys? Is it like an active sponsor, or is it more about the reason the sponsor is valuable is because it helps you get your numbers? I presume it's somewhere in the middle there that it's both.
I think it's definitely a mix. And one of the things that we're really lucky with is that we have so many different types of events in different regions around the country. So our partnerships team do a great job of trying to identify which particular parts of which events may resonate with a particular
approach them with an idea from your team. So I'm just trying to think of people listening about going, how do I get my volunteer program sponsored? And that would be one suggestion, would be finding an asset of your event that relates to a brand and pitching directly to them. What are some others there, Chris?
I think the other one could be what would massively enhance your volunteer program. So that could be, meals, something like food. I think food's really, really important, particularly with volunteers, or welfare. So whether that's, water or sunscreen or clothing, hats, particularly in areas where it's real warm. Sunscreen's really important. Water's really important. Hydration. Or it could be in areas, if you've got a winter event, something that keeps people warm, like soup or coffee or something like that. If you don't think about it from what could be done for the sponsor, it's what could massively enhance your volunteer program from a volunteer experience point of view. And then ultimately, if the volunteers are happy, your participants are happy, etc. And think about it like that, and actually then package it up and say, well, it may not be cash in the first year. In that particular instance, it may be value in kind, or offsetting some event costs that you previously had, like some volunteer food is a great example there, where
which is ultimately cash.
It is,
it's an expense you don't need to spend.
Yeah, and I think offsetting those costs. So I think they'd be the two ways I'd think about it. And I've been in meetings with our partnerships team, kind of sales type meetings, where you're trying to find out what is important to a prospective partner. And if community comes up, that's a great way that you can lock in a conversation.
Big time.
Because it's harder to engage the external community through sponsoring the recovery area.
Yeah, completely agree. And I should probably know this, Chris, but are you using the Rustify volunteer portals to put branding in? Is that important for them to have branding in the portal the volunteers are actively seeing every time they're logging in, or that's just a it happens because they're the sponsor?
Yeah, I think brand awareness and brand recognition is part of it, and the ability to see that through all of the key touch points. So it is branding the portal, but it's also making sure that it's verbally talked about in volunteer briefings or meetings or things like that. So last week, again, using the Queenstown Marathon example, we had the marketing manager from Skyline who spoke at our volunteer briefing, because, then it's a face and a name and a person rather than just a logo. And also at ASB Auckland Marathon, we have the Ryman volunteer team. They actually come down and help manage some of the volunteer lounge during check-in at Cloud in Auckland. So it's making sure there's people associated with it. It's definitely more difficult to activate if there's not a human side to it, because ultimately that is what volunteers are humans. So if it's just the brand, I don't think it works as well all the way through.
And it's such an interesting one about getting your volunteers more involved. It's a conversation for another time and probably another podcast, Chris, but one I've always had an interest in is engaging your volunteers to help fundraise too. I don't know if you could quickly touch on it. Is that something you've ever thought of, to link your volunteers with your charitable partners at all?
It's not something that I've got great experience of. We are still working on evolving our charity programs in New Zealand. We've actually got, for the first time, we've got a charity manager for the region who's based out of our Sydney office, Elizabeth, and she has got great ideas and experience and knowledge, and has really helped us developing, in particular, the Auckland Marathon program this year. So it's something I'll have to have a chat to her about, but I think, again, it may be trying to identify what the charity's needs are. I think that's really key. And then seeing if there's a way of linking those two things together.
Yeah, for sure.
For some of our events, we have a single charity. I think it's probably easier in those cases with something where you've got an overall charity program, which could be quite labor intensive and administrative to achieve. But it's a really interesting concept. Maybe I have to come back to you on that one.
No, of course. And more relative to charities running events like Cancer Council and Daffodil Day, where it's probably a closer connection from the volunteer database to the cause. And recently we actually built an integration with Give and Gain, a charitable platform, for that reason. So volunteers could basically track live, either start a fundraising campaign themselves from their portal or track how much money they've raised sort of within one experience, compared to needing to double handle things and need to jump through multiple hoops. So it's definitely a new concept. It's just an interesting one that I think has legs, and especially for next year when charities need more fundraising than ever, why not just ask the question? It's not too dissimilar to you sharing events that aren't your own to see if they're interested and just see what the uptake is. But like I said, conversation for another time, Chris, I think.
My mind's just going a million miles a minute now, thinking about ways you could engage, not just necessarily for charities, but if a particular volunteer did something special for an athlete and they're with a group or fundraising group, how we can profile those groups and what they're doing. So why are people volunteering? And then it's another way of seeing the engagement between athletes or spectators at an event and the volunteers themselves. So why are they volunteering, and telling that story? I think some of those stories get missed because there's so many stories around events. Perhaps that can be something that's told through the year rather than in that event week itself.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. One episode of the podcast, we have Taryn Evans. I've actually mentioned this a few times now because I love it so much. But at Melbourne Olympic Parks in Melbourne here in Australia, they do an end of year, the Workforce Awards night, basically, and pulling out those little stories and moments throughout the year and providing awards and gifts for volunteers and bringing up those stories. So I think it's something really special, and it's a great example of how organisations can reward and appreciate their volunteers annually and show the retention of volunteers and workforce. Like, they've had people that have been there for 30, 40 years straight. And I'm sure you would have volunteers that have been with your organisation for 10 plus years. Something that we can't do enough of, right? And it's just about resource and ability to do it too. Is there anything that you guys do in rewards for volunteers?
No, something that I think we could get a lot better at is how you say thank you. And again, it's down to each individual event. One thing that we do really, really well with IRONMAN New Zealand is the So Ironman New Zealand is a Saturday race, which is a little unusual for Ironman races. They're usually on Sunday. But Ironman's a Saturday race. And we have the athlete awards night and we leave that setup in place for Monday, and then we have a volunteer party. And again, that's made possible because of the massively engaged sponsor with Mercury. So they help, and we do it really, really well. Makes sense. Of our other events, we have barbecues with the volunteers, and barbecues are quite a good thing to do, I think, because it's a little bit more relaxed.
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
I don't think we've hit it really the nail on the head in terms of making that a really valued experience for the volunteers. The people that come massively love it, but they're a small percentage of the overall volunteer pool generally.
Sure. Yeah.
And then just to pick up on one thing you just said about length of time of volunteers, it was the 35th anniversary of Ironman New Zealand, and we had some volunteers that have volunteered in Taupo for over 20 years. They've done the same check-in at registration to the point where that's their desk. That's, if they come in, that's,
don't touch it.
This is my desk,
Yeah.
don't mess with it. And it's awesome that people feel so engaged that, it's sort of their right. They're like, oh, I've given so much to this. You don't tell me what to do. I'm going to tell you what to do. And that's awesome. You've got that history and experience. It's really fantastic meeting those people.
Absolutely. But like your events, you're always improving, right? And hopefully through this podcast, we can share some knowledge from around the world of what people are doing to reward and recognize volunteers, because I think we both agree you can never do enough in that space. So, mate, really insightful today. It's been awesome, Chris. So 3 last questions for you, a bit of a quick fire. So you've had a pretty broad range of experiences through your career. What does success look like for you personally when you're sitting at Christmas lunch at the end of the year? What is success with you and your career and the work you do?
Me personally is that we are getting better every time we do it. And when I say it could be anything. That could be an online seminar. It could be event delivery. It could be anything. I sometimes frustrate my team because I quickly move on to, where are we going next? Where are we going in 3 years' time? I'm not very good at celebrating success, perhaps, based on that, but making that we've just gone one better on everything, every time.
And then crazy moments that happen with volunteers and working with volunteers across your career, is there one that sort of stands out, happy, sad, fun, that really jumps out to you?
You mentioned you're going to ask me this question, and it's not necessarily a crazy moment. It was a really, really cool moment at the Pioneer mountain bike stage race that we had the first year we delivered it. That was a 7-day-long mountain bike race from Christchurch to Queenstown across the South Island of New Zealand.
Oh, that was tough.
It was tough for the athletes, but it was so hard for the crew. We'd move our race villages entirely every day. So tents for 400 riders, staff, catering, chill-out areas, finish line, start line, the works, hot showers, everything. And I got about halfway through the week and I was just really worried that we were just flogging everybody and that people were going to be having a really rubbish time. And I sat down one night to have my dinner and I sat down next to this volunteer. I said to him, hey, how you doing? Where are you from? He's from the US, this young guy. And I said, hey, how's your week going? And he just looked at me with this massive grin on his face and said, I am absolutely loving it. And the reason he was loving it is that he was getting an experience that no one else could pay for. He was going out in the 4-wheel drives up in the backcountry of New Zealand every day.
So true.
And he just said, I'd have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for this experience, and you're essentially feeding me for free for the week. And it was that moment I was like, actually, I feel a lot better now that you've said that, because I was a bit worried. As a volunteer moment, that stood out for me in terms of the different value proposition or the value exchange that different people get from volunteering. Yeah,
sure. One thing, we didn't really touch on it today, but about it's been a common thread through the podcast about treating volunteers as individuals. Everyone's turning up with their own intention of what they want to get out of the experience. Your volunteers that have been there for 20 years that just want to do the rego and don't get him away, I'm doing it this way, versus that guy, the young American guy who's happy to work 12 hours every day just because he loves it. How do you find the balance of that, and how do you make sure everyone's getting the experience, what they wanted to, compared to when you're dealing with 2,000 volunteers, treating them as a number on a spreadsheet? Because that's very easy to do when you have so much other things to worry about.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult.
Absolutely.
I think with our events, they exist for such a fleeting moment every year, and working out how you can put enough time in to engage with that's quite challenging. I think the only thing that we do really well at the moment is offer the time to chat if people want to and to share their stories. And I'd have to go and check, because I'm not sure it's part of our volunteer registration process, but I'd love to start gathering, why are people volunteering?
Correct.
We do
part of the early stages. Why are you being involved? What interests you? What shifts do you want to do? That sort of thing. Like, because again, and sorry for interrupting there, but I see it a lot that it's basically like, just apply here, and you could do anything. You could just be put at the mercy of the volunteer coordinator who's handling millions of spreadsheets to just slot everyone into shifts because they need to fill them. But do you know if you are asking those questions earlier, or you still need to find that out to make sure people, what they're signing up for and what they're doing is aligned?
So I know that we allow shift selection through Rosterfy, so people can choose. However, largely because we work on the group basis, by and large on a group basis, I think groups and the team functionality works great for that. But we almost lose another level of individuality through that.
That's tough. There's a balance of
and
efficiency and
they're obviously doing it for their group in that case. But I'd be really interested. I don't think we asked that question. I know we do for our athlete registration, because we spend a lot of time looking through it for really interesting stories. And I may have just had an epiphany on this call that we should do that for volunteers. But I'll certainly go and have a chat with our team, because that would be the obvious way of doing it. It would be just tell us. It's that classic. If you don't know something, ask.
Yeah, for sure. And sorry, that was a bit of a random question I threw in there, but it is interesting, and I think people gain a bit from that. Last one, mate, is top tips for engaging with volunteers.
Top tips. The first one is remember to say thank you. It can be so hectic during events that you go into your own world. I'm guilty of it myself, where you'll stand there and there's volunteers working away and you're absolutely exhausted yourself, but it's actually just remembering to say thank you, acknowledging them, introducing yourself, finding out who they are, what their name is, and making sure you're saying thanks. That's the first one. And I lead pretty much every volunteer presentation or engagement that I do by saying thank you up front, because the volunteers do so much for us. They are an integral part of the experience of the event. The second is working out ways to break down the vast amount of information and communication that people need to digest. We've found this year in particular, with all of the additional overlays and rules and regulations that we're implementing around health and hygiene and contact tracing for COVID-19, that it can be really overwhelming for some volunteers, and working out how you can break that information down. We had some great feedback from a group at Auckland Marathon who said, I've got to read an encyclopedia now, and all I want to do is hand out water to your athletes.
Mate, you're preaching to the choir there. Stop blasting people with information. I think it's just like, get so focused and niche, and just like, this is your role, this is what you need to know. It's a forever battle that everyone is on, to try and simplify things.
Yeah, and I think the old sort of methodology, which was invite people to come to a volunteer briefing and send them a handbook, is pretty antiquated now.
Yeah, totally.
And working out ways of making that interesting, whether it's video content or sort of online quizzes or whatever it is. I think there's some great examples out there from all over the place about how to do it. And our team's actually sort of working on that now, because from very recent feedback through Auckland and Queenstown, we've found that the amount that we're asking of people is higher and higher each year.
Yes.
COVID, one part of that, but health and safety. And we want to make sure people are safe and happy and going home at the end of the day, enjoying their experience. But discharging your responsibility by saying, please read this document, is not very fun.
Do you use the online training modules?
We haven't done previously. In fact, we are hoping to do that going forward. We're quite engaged with those around Sunshine Coast Ironman 70.3
Yes, sure.
And Cairns, Ironman Cairns.
Sure, yeah.
We just hadn't quite got the resource to implement that into New Zealand, but that's the intent. Yeah, absolutely. We've done that with our staff, with our online modules, and then it's really easy to track, to find out what people have done. And that massively speeds up the onboarding process at the venues and, when they arrive at the event as well, which is, if you can focus on the people side rather than the documentation and box ticking side when people arrive, I think that adds huge efficiency and value to the human side.
Yeah. And it's just, again, giving another option of making it easy compared to you must turn up to another. They're already volunteering on a weekend. Do they have to turn up for another thing for a briefing? If they live an hour and a half away, could they just access an online training module and turn up because you appreciate and respect their time too? So we're certainly seeing a shift in the way a lot of our clients around the world are moving more to online training and inductions, especially with COVID, to make people feel confident to turn up, to know that at least the organisation has these steps in play. And it's not mandatory that they do these trainings, but knowing that they're there sometimes has provided good feedback from volunteers to our clients. And I think it will be a change that happens through 2021, absolutely.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think you've touched on something there, which is a huge topic, which is how do you give people the confidence to volunteer?
Yeah.
It's a really challenging environment at the moment to be in mass gatherings for some people. I mean, there's others that don't seem to care, which is almost as frustrating because you're trying to educate them that they need to care a little bit more. But it's making sure people want to come. We, in New Zealand, we don't have mandatory face masks or face coverings. And our level system's quite binary. And in level 1, which is where we're at now, which is kind of, I guess, the lowest level of control with regard to COVID, we have health and hygiene measures to put in place and contact tracing. But there's no mask or face coverings. But we had thousands of face coverings, face masks available at the event.
Sure.
And I said in the volunteer briefing, please do not feel ashamed if you want to ask for a face mask. If you want to wear one, please do. And sort of normalizing that people can do what they want in that space. I actually had one in my pocket and I got it out and I waved it because I'd just come off a flight. But I think it's making sure that, if you want to wear gloves, even in an environment that doesn't say that a risk control is mandatory glove use, or if you want to wear a mask, or you want to request that you're in a particular role, which may be back of house rather than front of house, for whatever reason that is, I think it's giving people the choice and giving people the confidence that we are taking it seriously.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very interesting. Good work, mate. Well, look, it's been, we've gone a bit over time, but I think I certainly really enjoyed the time, and hopefully everyone listening today got something out of it too. So really appreciate it, mate, and all the best with the events that you're hosting coming up soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shannon. It's been a pleasure to chat. Great to catch up. And if any of your listeners want to ask any further questions or connect with me, then just hit me up on LinkedIn. That's the best place.
Or access your database. Just send you an email.
I'm going to regret if I get 100 emails off the back of this.
No, we are joking. All good. All right, mate. We'll speak to you soon, okay? Thanks again.
Cheers, mate. See ya.
That was our last episode of Season 1 of the Engage Volunteer podcast. I really love taking the time to learn more about volunteer management from all of our wonderful guests. Now, we'll be taking a short break with Season 2 of the Engage Volunteer podcast returning in March, where we've lined up an incredible selection of guests, including Anne Catherine, talking about FIFA's world first global volunteer community, Alki from Special Olympic World Games in Berlin, Karina Herold, Vice President of Events at the LA Sports and Entertainment Commission, and lastly, Mike Nishi from Chicago Event Management, who run the Chicago Marathon. Just to name a few, we have quite a selection coming up. To keep track of all new episodes or to listen to additional episodes, please make sure to click follow where you listen to your podcast. Thanks for joining us. We really do appreciate it.